In this video I'm going to show how I made a router table using an old kitchen caddy, well two, and just some other reclaimed materials. I had a rough idea of what I wanted and the dimensions of where I wanted to fit, so I tried to make a plan on SketchUp, but I don't know how to use SketchUp, so I went old school and just drew it out. So these are just rough dimensions, and I made a lot of mistakes throughout this project and made a lot of changes along the way. So this is just a general overview of how I wanted it. You'll see obviously it doesn't turn out like that, but I am happy with it. The braces on the caddy were not strong enough, so I started by replacing them with some ash. Then I just used the old rails to mark out the length of what the new ones are going to be. And you can see how thin they were. I was scared that it would sag, so I just didn't want to take a chance on it. So for the box, I used some plywood and cut it down with a track saw and the table saw. I know this is wider than it is longer. I should really cut it on the table saw, but I was very careful and took it slow. It was just easier than setting up the track saw again. And I just constructed a simple box with butt joints and glue and screws for the bottom. And then I just flipped it upside down to screw the drawer box carcass from the underside. So now that the frame's all put together, it's time to work on the top. So I just have this cheap router plate that I bought and a couple of these T-tracks, and I'm going to lay one out at the front and then I'm going to use two at the back for the fence to go on. So I just found the middle, I just drew around it, trying to keep it as straight as possible, and then drilled out the corners with a drill bit that matched the curved edges on the router insert plate, so I didn't have to try and make those curves. And I'm going to cut it all the way through and add some bands underneath it for some support and for the T-nuts. Then I took my router with a flush trim bit in and used a couple of pieces of scrap plywood as a straight edge and ran the flush trim bit along the straight edge to clean up the cut. I made sure that I stayed on the inside of the line so that I could sneak up on it, and then I just used a rasp and some sandpaper to check for the fit. I'm trying to get such a tight fit because I don't want to screw it down. I'm going to use some T-nuts so that I can micro adjust it, and if I screwed it down, I'm just lazy. I'd probably just not use it because it would just take too long to change router bits on it. So these battens are what's going to go on it to hold the T-nuts in place and also for the router plate to rest on. That's on the underside of the table. So I just cut them down and then drilled in some pilot holes, and I countersunk them, but it really wasn't necessary. And then I screwed them down. At this point I'm only putting screws through them rather than screws and glue because I'm going to use it to mark out where the T-nuts need to go, and then I'm going to take the plate off so that I can drill and screw them in. I used the plate that came with the router as well, just to make sure that I was leaving enough room on each side so that I could easily get into it and it wasn't going to be too small before I glued it. And after I put the T-nuts in, I scuffed up the veneered face so the glue would stick to it. So I spent a lot of time just playing about just to see how well I could get it to sit flush, and I was actually quite surprised at how well it did work. Considering it's such a cheap router plate, I can't remember how much it was, about £10 or £15. I left the nuts in it quite long because I was able to screw it manually with my fingers, and it seemed to hold in place really well. So I was quite happy with that. So then I moved on to putting the T-track in, and when I measured the thickness of the T-track, it was about 14mm and the table top was about 15. So before I started routing it out, I did actually reinforce it with some hardwood strips underneath, and I was hoping that that would provide a little bit of support for the router bit and not go through. So it's a bit of an experiment with that technique, but I just thought I'd give it a go and see if it worked. So then I just started routing out the channel with a piece of plywood as a fence, and then just using various bits of plywood or the T-track itself to move it along without keeping adjusting it. But then disaster struck. I don't know how I did it, but the plywood moved and I ended up cutting out a much wider gap than I needed to. So once I'd finished swearing, I thought of ways that I could fix it. So my first thought was that if I just made it a little bit wider and parallel on both sides, I could put a hardwood strip down the side and it would also make it look quite pretty. So I started doing that. And then I went through it and it was sitting too low then, so after more swearing I just decided to abandon this one because it was just getting quite tedious to repair, and I'd spotted that I actually had a really thick piece of MDF with a veneered side in my workshop, which I thought would work much better for it anyway. And on the plus side, I could actually use the router plate insert that I'd already cut out on this one as a template for doing it a second time, so it wouldn't take me as long. So I'm gonna redo the top with this. I would have ideally liked to use the white side, but it was a little bit damaged on that side. This was just an offcut in the bargain bin in B&Q. It was £4 according to the sticker, and it's nice and thick, so I think this will work much better anyway. So fast forward a little bit later and I've got this thick piece of MDF up to the same point that I was up to with the kitchen caddy top. The only difference is I've routed it out from the full length of it because I figured that I was going to actually put a small piece of the T-track at the end so that I could have a continuous line. So I didn't film this because it was exactly the same as what I did with the first one, except without the awful mistake. then I decided to paint the top, and I had silver spray paint or white spray paint, and as we're on lockdown it's really difficult to get any more. The white just wouldn't really go on, so I decided to spray it silver and see how I liked it. But I just wanted to add a little bit of colour onto it because I hate the colour of MDF. And when the paint was dried, I moved on to the side with some reclaimed plywood. So the last few cuts were for the inside walls, and they were supposed to be held in by pocket holes, but it didn't feel the best because the material was quite thin, so I also cut some blocks for additional support so that I could screw into there, and I just got it as square as possible. And then I moved on to the fence. So the fence is going to be movable. The two panels on the front will be, you'll be able to shift them from side to side to support the workpiece depending on how big the router bit is that we're using. So I started by drilling some holes with some fastener bits for the bolt heads to rest into so they don't protrude, and then I continued that with a drill bit to mark the back piece. I got rid of most of the material with the drill, and then I just cleaned it up with a router bit. The slats weren't perfect, but I just need it so that they can slide along and they'll work fine and won't be seen. And then I just glued the fence together. And then I made 2 holes either side of the fence aligned with the T-track at the back for the fence to ride along with, so that I can lock the fence with a ring knot. So it's actually been quite a while since I worked on this, and it's just been in my workshop storing bits of rubbish on it, which is why all the top's all marred up. So I will be repainting it. So this is where I got up to, because I did do a few things that I've not got the footage for. So I installed one of the drawers, which cut the wood down in the clip before this, and this block is going to hold router bits. I'm just storing junk on it at the moment, but I'm just going to add more drawers to it and then a large drawer at the bottom. I also added a bit to the back so that I could put my dust collector through the fence, and it was just a snug fit made by a Forstner bit, so I don't have to stick it down or anything like that. I added a chamfer to the bottom of the fence so that any dust wouldn't get stuck there, and I added the T-track to the fence. So again, there's been a big gap between doing more work on this, but I have added a few things since I last worked on it. So the top is really not in the best shape because of how much junk I was sort of storing on there. I added some filler to it wherever it become dented, where I've been dropping things on it and stuff. So I need to repaint this, but I didn't like the silver anyway, so I'm going to repaint that anyway, and it should be nice and smooth again. I've added 3 drawers to it, which are literally just on these cheap sliders, and they're just pieces of plywood that I cut down, and I'm going to just add like for example this block to put the router bits into it, and I'm just going to screw it from underneath. I think on this side I'm probably going to add some shelves. You'll notice that the bottom does look different, and that's because I rebuilt it using thicker material. It was only 12mm plywood before, so I've changed that to 18mm, and this has stopped the racking. It will stop racking as well when I put the back on it, but it was quite high. It was a bit too high to use as much as I wanted the storage for it, so it's much more comfortable to use now. So I moved on to making the large drawer at the bottom, which I've made from an old Corona pine dining table. So you can see some of the router marks in it where it had the design. I'm not really bothered about seeing this on the inside of the drawer, and obviously it'll have a drawer cover on it, so it was just nice and thick, and I want it to be strong. So as I wanted to use up as much of the kitchen caddy as I could do and other reclaimed materials, I wanted to reuse one of the drawers. It's not actually from the same kitchen caddy, it's from a different one. I just seem to have an abundance of them. But it was too big for the slot where I wanted it to go into, which is at the bottom to catch dust on the router table. So I just cut it down and redid the dados on it so that I could assemble it in the same way with just slightly smaller so that it fit where I needed it to. So on the right hand side I fitted some plywood shelves. Now I didn't actually have a small enough level to fit horizontally across, so what I did was I just used the ply markings themselves and I drew a straight line using a square across, and I just lined up the ply layers with that, and then I could fit a level in the other way to make sure the back was the same. So it worked out really well and quite easy to install that way. Some of the drawer slides from the kitchen caddy had these grooves in them, and I thought I could make use of them to make a holder for some tools by utilising that groove. So I just cut it down and assembled it. So when all the final bits were added on, it was just time to try and make this look as pretentious as possible. I added some colour and some hardwood on it just to get some colour really, but I don't know if it really goes, but I like it. I like having colours in my workshop. Everything's wood coloured. The chalkboard walls will be really useful for me because I'm always looking around for a pencil, and I put a little bit of glue next to it to hold a piece of chalk in at the bottom, and it seems to hold it in place even when you move the router, so it's nice and simple. So thank you for watching.